So Michael Silver is chairman and CEO of American Elements. He holds a law degree and an MBA from the University of Southern California, and is often in the news. The business news industry often turns to him to learn more about what the raw materials situation is. So we're very happy to have him here today to speak to us about what's happening in the supply chain that makes our industry possible. Please welcome Michael Silver.
Thank you, Eileen. There's a little handout on your chairs that's a piece I wrote in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago. Very good. Here we are. Probably most of you are familiar with the company, but we operate in 26 countries. We have manufacturing on 3 continents. We supply a little more than 50% of the Fortune 50. We're in your cell phone. We're in cars. As one of my sales guys says, if you look at the Intel slogan of Intel Inside, well, we're inside Intel. So we have a pretty good place right now in high technology industry, and I just wanted to share with you all where I see the issues in the world in terms of getting raw materials, the stuff that's going to hit us not just necessarily this year, but over the next several decades. Do we have any purchasing managers in the audience? Well, you're the guys I think they're going to find this the most interesting. So let me proceed. I'm going to start with a little bit of real ancient history, like the formation of the planet, just to give you a sense of how we got to where we are today. Where the meteors and comets landed and plate tectonics, and then ultimately with Homo sapiens establishing national borders, we ended up with a whole lot of winners and losers. And some countries did real well, and other countries didn't do so well. The U.S. is one of the countries that unfortunately didn't do that well. I brought something here. I just came from Europe, and one of the stops I made was in Cyprus. And this is a piece of 4,000-year-old slag that was given to me by the president of the copper mine in Cyprus. I'll say it again, 4,000-year-old slag. This is from when the Assyrians controlled that part of the world, and the Cypriots convinced the Assyrians to let them remain independent because they said, we can pay you greater tribute if you allow us to sell copper to the Hittites, to the Egyptians, to the Phoenicians, to all the other nations around, and the Assyrian king agreed. So the idea of geopolitics and minerals has been around for a long time, and it's actually quite beautiful if anyone wants to see it. It was a very nice gift of him to give to me. So let's look and see who some of the winners are, at least. This is one we all know quite well. One of the big winners has been China. They just hit it out of the park on the roulette wheel of minerals. They can basically control all rare earths on the planet, which is not their. They were just extremely lucky on this thing, and we all know the importance of rare earths. You just take yttrium, for example, a very magical mineral that is both YSZ, which I know you all know what YSZ is, but YSZ is not just a wonderful structural material. Excuse me. It's also the electrolyte in SOFC, as Mark at Kyocera mentioned, very important material. It's also part of the yttrium, barium, copper, high temperature conductive materials, which are going to become important once we figure out how to get it into a temperature that really makes sense. But China is not the only one with a great monopoly. Here's niobium. For those of you that work with niobates, almost all the niobium in the world is in Brazil. And if they followed down some of the same roads China did, we'd have some of the same geopolitical issues with Brazil. Here's another example, lithium. If any of you work with lithium for mold strengthening in your ceramics, you can see while China is currently the greatest producer of lithium raw materials, Bolivia, Chile, and where we should have one other one up there. Basically, there's a lake right in South America that basically has all the lithium in the world. And over time, they're going to be sort of like a mini OPEC with lithium as the energy sources move in that direction. Here's another one that I'm sure you're all familiar with. I'm picking metals you guys will be happy or very, very involved with. Tungsten carbide, for our friends from Coors Tech would know how important tungsten carbide is. Basically, all the tungsten carbide in the world happens to also be in China. So historically, what did people do with mineral monopolies? Here's an example of what they historically did. This is the OPEC crisis that older people like me will remember from the 70s. And what you did was you charged as much as you could. But the Chinese were much smarter than that. They realized, because they were a nation that not only had a monopoly, but also had the wherewithal to use all the materials that they could mine, such as the rare earths, that if they passed, instead of just selling them and making the most amount of money, if they passed the advantage down the supply chain to things like automobiles and aerospace and electric cars, that they could use that to not just produce maybe 10 or 20,000 jobs in the mining industry, but millions of jobs further down in industry. And that is essentially what China's done. Now, in saying this, I want to make some very important points, especially given the title the Wall Street Journal gave to my article, which I did not write that title, is this is not intended as a xenophobic speech. I think the Chinese are amazing. We have operating plants there. I have a big warehouse in Tianjin. We have manufacturing in Baotou. They've always been the greatest, honest people that I've worked with in terms of manufacturing. So nothing I'm saying is intended to be anti-Chinese. I want to make that very, very important, because I do respect the things they've done. And whenever the world has come down, like the WTO has said, look, guys, you can't do something a certain way, they always adhere to the law. So please keep that in mind. But here's the article. I hate the provocative title, but the Wall Street Journal likes to go down these very conservative routes. I did write the piece, if you happen to read it. The Chinese basically have taken advantage of that opportunity, and what they did was, until the WTO stopped them, was they established a price differential that allowed for the price of using a quota system, basically, but there were some other aspects to it, so that the price of rare earths in China were substantially cheaper than the price of rare earths outside of China. And that forced a lot of movement of companies. This is an image of General Electric. American Elements used to supply them with all their cerium, which goes into the envelope on incandescent bulbs. All the glass plants used to be in the United States. All the glass plants are now in China. We helped them make that move, but the reason they made the move was because of cerium. And they needed to get less expensive cerium. Also, there were other reasons, but that was probably the critical reason why they felt necessity to move that operation over to China. It's a very powerful thing to do, and the Chinese are very, very smart in realizing it's not about gross domestic product, like whose companies. It wasn't about just getting the Chinese companies to control these industries. It was more about just getting the jobs into their nation, because they're essentially an agrarian culture that's moving out of that environment and trying to industrialize and move into the modern world. So it didn't matter if it was a General Electric or a Chinese company, job's a job. And so they pushed very hard to get big manufacturers to move into their location. And it was a smart move on their part. Here's an example of when here's an example when General Electric first moved over. So now I want to move to next what the response was in 2012 when this first happened, and this is something I've talked to the Chinese about and the Chinese government officials. Here's an example in Europe where it says Philips reduces dependency on rare earths for LEDs. Here we see something similar in Japan. Hitachi comes up with something that doesn't require rare earths in motors. Here's another example in the US, a push to make motors with fewer rare earths. So what the response initially was something I wrote an article in the New York Times about, which I called innovation distortion. which is essentially the idea that when you've got an element on the periodic table, to think that it's innovation to come up with ways not to use an element on the periodic table, that's really a distortion of the advancement of humanity. It's not a good thing. And I've made arguments to Chinese government officials and given speeches in China saying, why are you doing this? If you already control all the rare earths in the world, why not allow all those millions of bright minds in the United States and Singapore and all the countries of the world to innovate and create amazing, wonderful things with the materials that you have absolute control over, rather than this kind of stuff where people are doing innovation to avoid the material you control. It has had absolutely no effect on the Chinese government or their positions, but I think it's a good argument. So one aspect of what I'm talking about is this idea of using control over those minerals you have in your country to force jobs into your nation, use them as a weapon to move industry to your country. Now I'll give you another example of a conflict situation, another example of weaponizing, in my mind, of raw materials. This is Dodd on the left and Frank on the right. You're all familiar with the Dodd-Frank bill that came out in 2012. It's primarily designed to impact the financial and banking community, but many people I think a lot of you in the industry, maybe the purchasing managers will know, that if you buy a mineral like cobalt out of a conflict zone, you have a filing you have to do with the federal government. We help our customers do that. Another smaller aspect of this situation is rebels using minerals in their zone to fund wars. And that's something that we should all work to stop. And it's a big issue in the country, in the world, and something that I think that we all have a responsibility to deal with. Now jumping to another, what I consider major issue in our world that we have a responsibility to deal with, and it's not the movie industry. I assume many of you have seen the movie Avatar. Who are the bad guys in Avatar? The answer is the miners. Miners are bad people, okay? And that is not a good thing when you consider that green technology is made out of things that come out of the ground. And I gave a presentation to the Sierra Club, this is probably 5 years ago, where I said, just did one of these things, I said, how many of you support solar energy and wind energy and electric cars and so forth? And of course, every hand went up. And then I said, how many of you support the mining of the raw materials you need to build solar panels, wind turbines, and electric cars? No hands went up. We hate mining. Mining is bad. So I explained to them that when you go from a hydrocarbon energy infrastructure, global infrastructure, to what's going to be, if it's done right, a multi-trillion-dollar green technology that allows for us to stop global warming, it doesn't stop mining. It just changes what you mine. You've got to accept the fact that things like the rare earths and many other materials are in the ground. These things are built out of the ground. And I will have people come up to me, very sensible, college-educated people, and they'll say, well, we'll make them out of something else. Like material science doesn't exist. That the discovery wasn't in material science. You know, that Silicon Valley is really Algorithm Valley. And you say to people, no, it's Silicon Valley because materials are what matters. It's not the technology that flowed from them. It was the discoveries of material science that created these technologies. That's something that I think we all have a responsibility to inform the world about, that you have to recognize that if you're going to create a green infrastructure to fix this planet, you've got to mine those materials. And I've made the suggestion in other articles that the environmental movement should get into the mining industry. Because if they want it transparent, they want it done right, they want it done friendly to occupational safety, then they should be running those programs. Of course, you know, they look at me like I'm crazy, but I think this audience understands what I'm talking about. It's something that really, really needs to change. Then last sort of general aspect of what I'm talking about is the overall weaponization of the world as a result of this need for materials. If any of you spend any time in Africa, which I do quite a bit of because we are very close to the mines to meet the needs of our facilities, China's doing an amazing job of providing all kinds of transportation services and various things for the African countries in exchange for the rights to mine in various locations. Wise decision, but it's causing lots of conflicts, and lots of countries like the United States are completely out of the game. And rather than encouraging the United States to kind of get in the game and start fighting over these minerals, I think we need a different approach. So my last slide, because I'm moving as quick as I can here, is my presentation was entitled something like, it had the word solution. So here's my solution component, and I just want to kind of address these things. And fundamentally, it's up to us. It's up to people in this room to really deal with these issues and step up to the plate and help the world stop the weaponization of minerals, which is really what's going on. You're further down the supply chain, being in the industry that everyone is in this thing, but bottom line, you're all about material science, ultimately. And things have to change. My first point is we have to stop this idea that nations use their minerals to drive business to their countries. The raw materials that we require, both the rare earths, tungsten, you name it, should be sold on the open market, whether you're in the country or outside a country that controls those materials at the same price. So everybody who's innovative, every kid that gets involved in high technology has the opportunity, the same opportunity to work with those materials, and it's innovation that drives success, not the ability to control minerals because they just happen to have landed in your country when the plate tectonics essentially stop moving, in the long term. Secondly, I fully support the idea that is part of Dodd-Frank, but I think there's lots of better ways to do it, of not supporting rebels using conflict minerals. It's a horrible, horrible situation, causing a lot of deaths. It's a strong incentive for wars in Africa particularly, and I think efforts like that are particularly very, very important. And then finally, I think as a critical element of this is we got to get the 60s mentality in the environmental movement out and start talking up and convincing the world that when it comes not necessarily to hydrocarbons, I'm not a coal miner. I mean, I get it. Those are not good things. Well, I don't want to stop anyone here that has a different opinion. I'm sure there's lots of opinions in this room. But when it comes to things like the rare earths, when it comes to those materials that are necessary to build solar panels and build those things that are going to save the planet, we have to start talking to the environmental movement and getting kids and everyone to realize that mining is not a horrible thing if it's done to save the planet. And that's the end of my comments. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. I can also show you my beautiful piece of slag if you're interested.
Thank you, Michael. We have a microphone up here. If anybody has a question, we have about 5 minutes for questions for Michael. Well, I have a question.
Okay. Yes.
When we're talking
Yes,
about, the mining of rare earths and so forth, every now and then you hear about this idea of urban recycling, the idea of retrieving and recovering the raw materials, especially the rare earths that we've already used and bound up in a magnet or something. From your perspective, what would you say about the viability of that idea?
Sadly, I'd have to say it's not viable in the big picture. We've done quite a bit of recycling, but it's more of a cost that you would do it as an important matter for environmental safety. But the thing with all of these materials is even if you can't open up the Wall Street Journal and see what the price is, like a copper or a gold or a nickel, they're still commodities. And what a commodity essentially means is if it costs me $1 to produce 1 pound of neodymium oxide and it costs you $2, you're not just a secondary provider, you're out of business. And the cost to retrieve these materials from these tiny little things, and what happens is we did a number of I could go into several different recycling programs that our company has had over the years. The cost to do recycling is horrendous. People don't do what they say they're going to do. We were the only company in the world that was recycling neodymium from neodymium iron boron magnets. If you know what, the high-strength magnets are made out of neodymium now today. Your earplugs on your thing, that stick together, the ear pods, those are neodymium iron boron magnets. But in the very beginning, there was a lot of scrap neodymium iron boron. We were collecting it from all over the world, and we had a proprietary technology for recovering the neodymium out of the iron and the boron. Well, we'd get drums full of oil and rags, and nobody respected the idea of recycling properly, and it's something we eventually had to give up because it's just a very difficult way to be competitive with someone like China, where on the Baogong mountain range, which is just outside of Baotou, China, you could literally pick up a hand of dirt and it's like 7-8% rare earths. So their cost to produce a pound of neodymium was so much less than what we could produce it for that we really couldn't stay in business doing it as valuable as it was. Of course, if the government steps in and provides subsidies for the effort, it's still obviously not cost effective, then of course that kind of thing can help. But it's not a business, to be honest with you, and I tried to make it a business for a long, long time.
Interesting.
Okay.
On the topic of China, I know that in some areas they're doing a lot now to more or less clean up their act in terms of eliminating pirates, minerals pirates, and imposing some environmental regulations, and it's putting the squeeze a little bit on especially the refractories industry. So do you see that that trend in China impacting other higher value kinds of minerals like rare earths?
When I was, I'm kind of credited with opening up the Chinese rare earths industry back in the 90s in terms of them shipping, when the Cold War ended, I sort of jumped in real quick and got involved in shipping rare earths to Europe, Japan, and the United States. It was actually one point when American almost was the sole supplier out of China, which was a beautiful thing while it lasted. And in those days, you literally would see rivers on fire. It was pretty bad. They have done an amazing job in cleaning up the environment. I would say they're maybe, in fact, I think they are ahead of us in terms of environmental. So it's kind of a misunderstanding that China is not a good player in the environmental industry. They've been fantastic. So the cost will go up as a result because any kind of additional cost to increase the cost of the end product. But you gotta applaud the effort, and I think that industry can absorb the cost. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for helping us understand what makes our industry flow. We appreciate it very much.
Appreciate it.